Alexis de Tocqueville was only 25 in 1831 when he decided to leave France and visit the United States. A scion of the highest ranks of the French nobility, he was still loyal to the absolute monarchy of the deposed Bourbon king, and he thought he had no future serving the constitutional monarchy, so-called July monarchy, the July 1830 revolution that put in place. He was at the time an apprentice prosecutor at the Versailles courthouse, but with poor speaking ability and a voice that didn't carry, he was quite unhappy in his job. He and his colleague, Gustave de Beaumont, decided to get out of France for a while, leave the country until their options might become clearer. They had connections, and they had a promising idea. They were successful in being granted a leave of absence from the courthouse with an assignment from the government, from the French government, to go to the US at their suggestion, at the Tocqueville's and Beaumont's suggestion, and at their expense, and investigate penitentiary reform. As Tocqueville told his friends at the time, the prison investigation was merely an honorable pretext to study what a society based on, quote-unquote, equality of conditions, meaning no aristocratic privileges at birth, was like, and if he could ever live in one. It is important to realize that for the young Tocqueville, as well as for his family and friends, equality was a bad word. Equality meant the end of privileges that guaranteed aristocratic liberty. For their caste of nobles, equality was powerlessness. Visiting America transformed Tocqueville's understanding of equality. He realized that equality could be, for a significant part of the white population, not the end of liberty, as he had previously believed, but instead a route to liberty. Tocqueville was never interested in the negative liberty of rights. He conceived of liberty as a positive act of will, not an enemy of all authority, but, I quote, a civil and moral quality that made it possible for individuals, singly or in groups, to realize their potential. Citizens were totally free, he said, when they could engage what is just and good without fear. After spending 9.5 months in the United States in 1831-32, where he interviewed about 200 Americans, filled up multiple notebooks with observations and commentaries, and sent detailed letters home, asking recipients to keep them, and then comparing and contrasting his American observations with the situation in France and other observations from 2 subsequent trips to England, the tertium quid of the comparison, Tocqueville brilliantly framed modern history in the 2 volumes of Democracy in America as a continuous struggle between liberty and equality. Tocqueville spent almost a month in Philadelphia in October and November 1831, and I want to say briefly how his visit here in Philadelphia helped him write Democracy in America. At first, Tocqueville didn't like Philadelphia at all. Tocqueville was prone to mood swings. He felt easily depressed. He felt easily insecure. During the trip, his travel companion, Beaumont, often kept him going. Tocqueville had felt great in Boston, among former Federalists, proto-Whigs, he had met and befriended John Quincy Adams, Edward Everett, his brother Alexander Everett, Unitarian minister Jared Sparks, others. Tocqueville had recognized the Boston elite as kindred spirits, men who, like him, believed that, I quote, if a people is to be Republican, it must be level-headed, religious, and highly educated. His New England host worried about social change as much as he did. They disdained Jacksonian democracy. Tocqueville, who had crossed the ocean in part to determine whether he could ever live in a democracy, was equally apprehensive of growing popular sovereignty. Now in Philadelphia, with a large French contingent living in Philadelphia, Tocqueville was, in a sense, much closer to home than in Boston. But that was the source of the problem. Too many French exiles, descendants of noble families that had fled the French Revolution, and the flow of French visitors reminded him of why he was questioning aristocratic prejudices. Tocqueville resented their pompous disdain for American manners. He thought no better of French diplomats whose stupidity was, Beaumont said, difficult to overlook. The two friends saw one play in French, and one was enough. They found French theater in Philadelphia awful, performed by horrible actors. Now, Tocqueville disliked even the city's layout. It was too geometric, too simple. He reported to a correspondent a story he had heard of a man reaching the point of distraction in Philadelphia by, quote, running from door to door in a city where all streets appear alike. The man, quote, looking at every nameplate in a vain hope of retracing his steps to the house of the woman he planned to elope with. He lost confidence in Philadelphia. He wrote to his mother that all he had was a jumble of notes and disconnected ideas and didn't know how to frame them. Now, the prison investigation, the pretext, shook Tocqueville out of his torpor. In Philadelphia, Tocqueville had a chance to contrast the two main systems of penitentiary reforms in America. In the Auburn Sing Sing system, which he and Beaumont had studied in detail while in New York State, inmates worked in groups during the day, in total silence enforced by the whips of a few guards, followed by solitary confinement at night. Tocqueville strongly resented the use of the whip to maintain order during the workday and silence during the workday. Now, at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, or Cherry Hill Prison as it was called at the time, Tocqueville and Beaumont observed a Quaker-inspired system of imprisonment of full-time solitary confinement. Cells were designed for solitary confinement. They were large enough to include a workbench and give prisoners the opportunity to ply a trade in isolation. Each cell had plumbing and access to a small individual exercise yard. The prison opened in 1829. It was an experiment Tocqueville and Beaumont were eager to study. Tocqueville made a point of interviewing as many inmates as possible, alone with them in their cells, and he wrote reports of his conversations with 40 of them. Minimizing the very real threat to mental balance long-term solitary confinement posed, Tocqueville reported that inmates recognized the benefits of seclusion towards rehabilitation. Several expressed hope that their anonymity while in prison will allow them to re-enter society. Tocqueville eventually assessed punishment at Cherry Hill at once milder and more terrifying than any other punishment yet invented. It aims solely at the prisoner's mind, but achieves incredible power over it. I will not go further today regarding the controversy the rival systems generated in reform circles here and abroad. I will just mention that the Philadelphia penitentiary didn't function nearly as smoothly as Tocqueville and Beaumont were led to believe. One reason Tocqueville eventually supported its adoption in France, which didn't happen, was the absence of corporal punishment. But just 4 years after the visit, a damning report provided the Pennsylvania legislature with an alarming list of extrajudicial punishments inflicted on inmates at Cherry Hill, but Tocqueville never knew any of that. What I want to say is that the comparative study of the Auburn and Philadelphia prison systems significantly helped Tocqueville sharpen his understanding of democracy. Tocqueville viewed institutions through the lens of equality. In the prison investigation, his focus was on the equality that remains when you take freedom away. The prison report concerned only convicted criminals. Indicted criminals would use their wealth for bail, but convicted criminals were treated equally in either system, regardless of their rank in society. In prison, they were all reduced to the same low common denominator. The American penitentiary, in Tocqueville's construction, became the image of an inverted America. For free Americans, equality meant access to opportunity and self-realization. But for inmates, equality kept them all at the same level. The American penitentiary was therefore a microcosm of an extreme state of equality. Equality for all with liberty for none. A cautionary tale of what a failed democracy could be. Tocqueville had reflected on how French kings who practiced absolutism for centuries had gradually turned all, including nobles, into subjects. In the prison report, he and Beaumont made a surprising analogy between American criminals and subjected French nobles. They stated that American prisons, quote, offer the spectacle of the most complete despotism. But they didn't elaborate. Francis Lieber, political philosopher, whom they had met in Boston, when translated the report into English, did not understand what the authors meant by this. He felt compelled to add a translator's note to correct what he took to be Tocqueville's and Beaumont's misconception and point out the impropriety of calling a system despotic, which mainly grew out of the feeling of humanity. Philadelphia is also really the only place in America where Tocqueville, the great theorist of association, observed the workings of a few associations. Unbelievably, Tocqueville had missed the benevolent empire the Second Great Awakening generated. Even though he traveled along the Erie Canal in summer 1831, he never heard of religious revivals. He never heard of Charles Grandison Finney or any of the others. While in Philadelphia, though, if Tocqueville learned something of Benjamin Franklin's pioneering associative initiatives, he made no record of it. But he observed the temperance movement and temperance societies, and he was especially impressed by the use of associations to achieve moral ends. He also observed a free trade convention, which of course is not an association, but this was an opportunity for him to see how like-minded people could come together to promote a cause. He was impressed and noted that the phenomenon of association was one of the most remarkable things about this country, and generalized from it that the power of associations had developed to the full in America for commerce as well as for political, literary, and religious interest. In nearby Baltimore, John Latrobe, son of Benjamin Latrobe, the architect of the US Capitol, concurred with these observations. Moreover, Latrobe told Tocqueville what the latter had already heard from Jared Sparks in Boston, that the most important reasons for Americans' ability to administer themselves is that they were used to doing so. What must be explained is how we acquire that habit. Thus began, with only modest empirical observation, Tocqueville's ambitious theory of association, which was designed to become a major contribution to American political theory. What about political parties? Tocqueville had left Boston aware that the clashing Federalist and Republican parties of the early Republic had lost their constituencies. In Philadelphia, Tocqueville had a chance to interview Nicholas Biddle, president of the Second Bank of the United States, and Biddle repeated what Tocqueville had already heard in Boston regarding the decline of original parties. Great debates were things of the past. Political passions must now inevitably attach themselves to the details of administration. John Quincy Adams, who attended the meetings at Biddle's home here in Philadelphia, concurred with this observation, but the timing of the conversation was most unfortunate. With his growing opposition to Jackson, whom he had earlier supported, Biddle was about to become one of the men responsible for the return of great parties in American politics, with the creation of the Whig Party, when Jackson, in his second term, removed illegally the federal deposits from the bank. Tocqueville basically repeated this conversation verbatim in Democracy in America. He recognized how conflicting visions of political economy, bank and tariff alike, posed a threat to the Union, but failed to detect the formation of the second party system. It was also in Philadelphia, and I'm almost done, with excursion to Baltimore, that Tocqueville and Beaumont began to think harder about race. Their location afforded them the first contrast between free and slave trades and slave states. Philadelphia had about 15,000 free persons of color in 1831. But as Beaumont noted, though nominally free, free blacks didn't have civil rights, and correctly added, laws do not change mores. Several people also discussed race with Tocqueville and Beaumont in Philadelphia, and they strongly believed that the country was at risk of a race war. Among them, Pierre-Étienne Duponceau, a French émigré who served as president of the American Philosophical Society from 1828 to 1844, told them that blacks would someday avenge themselves violently from the contempt in which they are held. The blacks will arm themselves against their enemy, and they will be exterminated. There is no way out of the situation our ancestors created when they brought slavery here other than massacre. Finally, in Philadelphia, Tocqueville intended on finding out why American lawyers had held such sway, got a crash course on common law, of which he knew little. Much of the answer, he realized, was that lawyers were the repository of special knowledge nobody else could easily access. In Philadelphia, Tocqueville filled up an entire notebook of conversations on common law. He had been trained in Roman and codification on the subject with Henry Gilpin, the U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. Tocqueville spent only a few weeks in Philadelphia in 1831. Then, in these few weeks, he sharpened his vision of equality and liberty by contrasting equality in powerlessness with equality in freedom. By observing some associations, he began to develop a theory of civil society. He realized also the intensity of racial conflict, and with it, the fragility of democracy. His fears resurfaced with great intensity in the 1850s as the political crisis brewed. Tocqueville's deepest belief and much of his message is that democracy is an act of will on the part of every citizen, each contributing to a project in need of constant revitalization and of the strength provided by stable institutions. His work has given not only Americans, but others around the world insight into the democratic experiment, and above all, inspiration to pursue it.
Thank you very much. Questions? Well, I might start by asking, I realized that you added the material on incarceration and prisons because of the symposium that we're having this afternoon.
Right.
And I could ask if you'd say a little bit more about how that material changed the story that you've been telling us about Tocqueville. If it did change it.
Well, it did change it. It's it was the official reason for Tocqueville and Beaumont's mission. I mean, assignment to go to America, which they managed to do, and prison reform was in the air in Europe, in various countries, and their main preoccupation was really rehabilitation. What do you do to rehabilitate criminals? And of course, it was also the time when, the penitentiary was an alternative to the guillotine. I mean, and it became more and more important to create those institutions where people could be rehabilitated. Now, so Tocqueville, in a sense, was it's often said that he visited mostly the more aristocratic Americans, Bostonians, and so on and so forth. He actually also talked to a very large number of Jacksonians, Jackson supporters. But by going to prison, and interviewing prisoners and prison chaplains, he really had an experience of what life was like if you were in that situation, if you are not part of the main society, if you are excluded. And so his reasoning about exclusion in America and powerlessness became normally a very important part of his conviction that at the time, at least, he felt, compared to Europe, that Americans had reached a much better balance between equality and liberty than was known, possibly.
More questions? Yes, Tom? Here comes Annie with yes.
You ended with that rather grim, Tom Licker, you ended with that rather grim observation of Tocqueville's friend on the question of race, and that would be race war, which is in some sense a continuation of a guilty response to the fear of slave revolt, and black revolt goes back centuries. Was there a more optimistic or thought-through response of Tocqueville and his friend on the question of race in America?
Not really. Not really. First of all, Tocqueville was an abolitionist all his life. Tocqueville was an abolitionist all his life. He fought. He was a politician as well as a writer, and joined the French Chamber in 1839. And one of his first assignment was the abolition of slavery in the French Caribbean. He was in touch with American abolitionists all the way through. Charles Sumner was a friend of his and recovered from the caning at Tocqueville's home in Normandy. So Tocqueville had a long association with the abolitionist movement. In Democracy in America, he wrote the last chapter of the volume 1, 1835, separately, explaining that he couldn't really think possibly of the question of race as part of the democratic experiment. And therefore, this is why he was treating the questions in a separate chapter. So I really feel that Interestingly enough, too, toward the end of Tocqueville's career and life, he died young, he became involved in a very deep controversy with Arthur de Gobineau, his former assistant, who had written the essay on the inequality of races. And those letters are incredible in the ways in which Tocqueville really expound on the equality of all men. So I think he was, what is remarkable about Tocqueville's Democracy in America is that he was able to overcome his fear of this race war, which he actually predicted, even though he didn't predict the war between the states that took place, but he was able to overcome this to actually write a book on democracy. While his friend Gustave de Beaumont said, well, I cannot really write on American democracy because of the race issue, so he ended up writing a novel on race and didn't write the book which Tocqueville he had initially intended to write with.